When you walk away from a narcissist, you are not only leaving behind a person, you are breaking apart a system they relied on to feel strong, secure, and emotionally real. And what happens after that is usually very different from what most people expect. It is not just ordinary heartbreak. It becomes a psychological unraveling that follows a very predictable pattern. A pattern that often says far more about them than it ever did about you. If you are beginning to notice these patterns in your own experience, take a quiet moment and really think about them. Awareness is the first real step toward ending cycles that keep you emotionally trapped. Stay with this, because the next stages are where the deeper reality starts to show itself. The first stage begins the moment you emotionally detach in a way that is solid, clear, and no longer open to negotiation. What may appear calm on the outside for them is often a major internal disruption. This is not heartbreak in the usual sense. It is a shock to their entire system of control. You were never just a partner or emotional connection to them. You became a psychological anchor that reflected back an identity they depended on. And when that reflection disappears, it creates deep confusion inside them. They may look unaffected at first, even distant or cold, but internally there is disorientation because the usual ways they regulate their emotions and sense of self are no longer functioning in the same way. This disruption can feel almost like a blackout inside their emotional world. The predictability they had with you, your reactions, your emotional availability, your role inside the relationship dynamic suddenly disappears. That predictability was not something they openly appreciated, but it was something they quietly depended on. Without it, there is now a space they do not know how to fill immediately. At this point, they are not thinking about loss in the same emotional way you might. Instead, they are trying to understand why their influence is no longer creating the same response. A very important shift is happening underneath everything. They are facing a version of reality where they are no longer in control. And that alone becomes deeply unsettling to their emotional structure. The second stage begins almost immediately after that first disruption, and it is rooted in denial. Not the loud or dramatic kind of denial people usually imagine, but a quieter and more calculated refusal to accept that the connection has truly ended. In their mind, your absence does not yet feel permanent. It simply feels like a temporary interruption, something that can still be fixed, reversed, or controlled again if they make the right move. They begin leaning on old patterns because in the past, distance and conflict were often followed by reconnection. So naturally, they assume this situation will follow the same emotional script. That is why they may act as though nothing major has really changed. They might send a casual text, make a small joke, or quietly reappear in subtle ways that seem harmless on the surface. But those actions are not random at all. They are testing the connection. They are checking to see whether you are still emotionally reachable and whether your attention is still available to them. Internally, they continue holding on to the belief that you are still within their emotional reach. Fully accepting that you are no longer available would force them to face a loss of control, and they are not prepared to confront that reality yet. So instead, they create a version of reality where you are simply distant for the moment, not truly gone. This stage can feel confusing because on the outside, it may even look calm or emotionally mature. But underneath that surface is resistance. They are not actually processing the breakup or separation. They are delaying it emotionally while assuming they can still step back into your life whenever they choose. The third stage begins when denial starts breaking apart and action replaces it. Once they notice that you are no longer reacting the way you used to, that the familiar emotional patterns are no longer working, a major shift takes place. What was passive assumption becomes active pursuit. This stage is not driven by emotional clarity or true accountability. It is driven by urgency. The loss of control is starting to feel real, and they suddenly feel pressured to regain it. This is usually where manipulation becomes easier to notice. You may hear apologies that sound unusually emotional, promises of change that feel convincing, or emotional vulnerability that seems completely different from their normal behavior. Suddenly, they may say everything you once hoped they would say. But these moments are usually not coming from deep self-awareness or lasting emotional growth. They are strategic attempts to reopen the connection and pull you back into the old dynamic where they regain influence over you. They may also change tactics depending on what they believe will affect you the most. If vulnerability and softness do not work, they may switch to guilt by reminding you about your shared memories or suggesting you are giving up on something important. If that still does not work, they may try frustration, pressure, or subtle emotional provocation just to create a reaction. At the center of this stage is a refusal to accept that the relationship ended on your terms. They are not focused on understanding why things fell apart. Their focus is on changing the outcome. What matters most to them is not healing or resolution. It is regaining access to you and restoring the sense of control they feel slipping away. The fourth stage is where the emotional tone changes sharply. What once looked like pursuit now becomes frustration and emotional hostility. When their attempts to pull you back fail, their psychological defenses begin moving in a completely different direction. Instead of restoring the connection, they now try protecting their self-image by reducing the value of what they lost. This is where anger and devaluation often begin to appear. You may suddenly notice a dramatic change in how they speak about you or about the relationship itself. The same connection they once chased intensely may now be described as meaningless, flawed, exaggerated, or emotionally unimportant. But this reversal is not based on truth. It is a defense mechanism. If they can convince themselves that you were never truly valuable, then your absence feels less threatening to their ego and emotional stability. This stage often includes blame shifting. The attention moves away from their behavior and onto your supposed flaws or mistakes. They may reinterpret old situations, focus only on conflict, or reshape memories in ways that allow them to appear misunderstood rather than responsible. The emotional intensity during this stage is not random. It comes from internal discomfort they cannot directly face. There may also be moments of visible irritation, resentment, or hostility, especially if they feel ignored, rejected, or replaced. What they cannot recover through charm, they often try to neutralize through criticism. Creating emotional distance allows them to avoid fully facing the deeper reality of loss. But underneath the anger, there is still emotional instability. The devaluation is not proof that they no longer care. It is a way of managing emotions they do not know how to process honestly. By reducing your importance, they are trying to restore balance inside themselves without admitting that something meaningful was actually lost. The fifth stage usually involves distraction and replacement. Once anger and blame no longer fully protect them from emotional discomfort, they often begin searching for something external to restore their damaged sense of control and validation. This is where they may suddenly appear happier, busier, more social, or quickly involved with someone new. To outsiders, it may even seem as though they moved on effortlessly. But what often looks like healing is actually emotional avoidance. The new attention, the new connection, or the sudden changes in lifestyle are frequently being used as emotional regulation tools. They are searching for another source of validation to quiet the instability they feel internally. This is why the transition can sometimes happen very quickly. It is not always about deep emotional attachment to another person. It is often about escaping discomfort. At this stage, they may present an image of complete confidence and emotional freedom. Social media may suddenly become more active. They may appear unusually positive, successful, or emotionally unaffected. But much of this presentation is carefully constructed to restore their sense of identity and control. The image becomes more important than the emotional truth underneath it. And despite appearances, the original emotional wound often remains unresolved. External distractions can temporarily reduce discomfort, but they do not create genuine emotional stability. The inner imbalance still exists beneath the surface, even if it is hidden behind attention, activity, or a replacement connection. The sixth stage is the one people rarely recognize clearly because it is quieter and much less dramatic than the earlier stages. This is the stage of internal emptiness and narrative repair. Once replacement no longer fully stabilizes them and the emotional intensity fades, something more uncomfortable slowly starts rising beneath the surface of everyday life. It is not usually an obvious breakdown. It is more subtle than that. A quiet emptiness, restlessness, dissatisfaction that cannot easily be explained away. At this point, the external strategies, pursuit, anger, distraction, replacement, stop fully regulating what is happening inside them. There becomes a gap between the image they try to maintain and the emotional stability they actually need. Instead of directly facing this gap, they begin rebuilding the story of what happened in ways that protect their identity. This is where rewriting the narrative becomes extremely important to them. They may describe the relationship in ways that protect their ego, emphasizing how they were hurt, misunderstood, or ultimately unaffected by the ending. This is not always conscious manipulation in the traditional sense. Much of it happens as psychological self-protection. The mind reshapes memories in order to reduce emotional discomfort and preserve identity. Real accountability is often absent during this stage because accountability would require them to face emotions they have spent their entire life avoiding. It would require genuine reflection, vulnerability, and emotional responsibility. And for someone deeply trapped in narcissistic patterns, that level of self-confrontation can feel emotionally unbearable. So instead, the mind creates safer explanations. Explanations that reduce guilt, protect pride, and keep their identity intact. And this is the part many people misunderstand the most. When you leave a narcissist, the real impact is not always visible in dramatic emotional displays. Sometimes the deepest effect happens quietly, internally, in ways they may never fully admit, even to themselves, because what they lost was not simply a relationship. They lost a mirror they depended on to stabilize their identity, their control, and their emotional structure. That is why your healing matters so deeply after these relationships. Because once you finally step out of the cycle, you begin seeing the difference between real love and emotional dependency. You begin understanding that genuine connection does not require confusion, control, fear, or emotional instability. Real love does not constantly force you to abandon yourself just to keep the peace. And the longer you remain away from the chaos, the clearer everything becomes. The emotional fog slowly lifts. The manipulation becomes easier to recognize. The patterns that once confused you start making sense. And most importantly, you begin reconnecting with the version of yourself that existed before survival became your normal emotional state. Sitting with vulnerability, emotional pain, loss, and personal responsibility often feels deeply uncomfortable and emotionally destabilizing. Instead of fully facing those emotions, the attention usually shifts toward rebuilding a sense of inner stability. If the situation can be explained through a story that protects their self-image, then the discomfort becomes easier to carry. But underneath all of that, the unresolved emotional pattern still remains. It has not actually been healed or processed. It has only been controlled and pushed into the background. And because it was never truly understood or integrated, it often returns again later in different relationships through the same emotional needs for validation, reassurance, control, and emotional regulation that became visible once you walked away. The seventh stage is the return of the cycle, where the process starts repeating itself instead of truly ending. After the emotional chaos settles and the personal narrative has been rebuilt internally, there is often a reactivation of interest in the original relationship. This does not always happen quickly, but when it does, it is usually not driven by deep emotional awareness or genuine reflection. More often, it is connected to retesting emotional access and restoring a familiar psychological structure that once felt stabilizing to them. At this point, they may come back in quiet or direct ways. A message, a reaction to your content, a random memory, or a casual check-in can become a way to reopen communication. On the surface, it may appear as curiosity, nostalgia, or simple friendliness. But internally, it is often about seeing whether the emotional connection is still available in some form. The distance you created earlier is not fully accepted as permanent. Instead, it is treated like a boundary that might still move or soften over time. What motivates this return is not necessarily healing or emotional growth, but repetition. Their internal emotional system is still focused heavily on outside validation. And when newer sources of attention, reassurance, or emotional comfort begin to feel unstable or unsatisfying, the mind naturally looks backward toward older emotional patterns that once provided regulation. You become connected to a familiar emotional template, something that once helped organize and stabilize their sense of self. Because of that, the return is often less about truly understanding you as a person and more about reconnecting to what the relationship once gave them emotionally on the inside. If emotional access is restored, the cycle can slowly begin again. Idealization returns, control patterns begin reappearing, frustration builds, emotional withdrawal follows. If access is denied, then they may pull away once more into self-protective narratives, emotional distancing, or replacement connections. Either way, the deeper pattern usually does not fully end during this stage. It simply adjusts itself and repeats in different forms because the core emotional mechanism underneath it has never actually changed or healed internally. The eighth stage is often the quietest stage of all, and also one of the most misunderstood. This stage involves emotional bypassing and dissociation from accountability. After enough cycles of chasing, anger, replacement, emotional confusion, and narrative rebuilding, the mind eventually settles into a kind of protective emotional distance from the truth of what happened. This is not genuine peace or emotional closure. It is avoidance that has slowly become stable enough to function like normal life. At this point, they are no longer actively trying to get you back, punish you, or emotionally replace you in the same intense way as before. Instead, they begin separating themselves from the emotional weight attached to the experience itself. The relationship becomes compartmentalized in memory. It turns into something that happened rather than something that still requires emotional honesty, self-reflection, or deeper responsibility. They may speak about the past in emotionally flattened ways that remove the intensity and complexity of what was once there. A connection that once felt emotionally consuming may now be reduced to simple phrases designed to protect their identity and reduce discomfort. They may say things like, "It just didn't work out," "We were too different," or "It was never really that serious anyway." But this is not emotional healing in the true sense. It is emotional simplification that helps keep deeper discomfort from rising back to the surface. Internally, this stage allows them to continue functioning without directly confronting unresolved emotional patterns or deeper insecurities. But the cost of that avoidance is subtle repetition. Because nothing was truly processed, understood, or transformed internally, the same emotional structure often shows up again later in new situations with different people, but very similar emotional dynamics. From the outside, it may look like personal growth or maturity, but more accurately, it is emotional compartmentalization without real transformation. The past is not genuinely healed. It is simply stored away in a mental space where it no longer threatens the current version of identity they are trying to maintain. And because of that, the cycle is never completely finished. It is only paused until another person, situation, or emotional trigger activates it again. When you step back and look at all of these stages together, what becomes visible is not really a story about love being lost. What you are actually seeing is a cycle involving control, emotional regulation, identity protection, and psychological repair unfolding in a sequence. It moves from shock to denial, from pursuit to frustration, from anger to replacement, from emotional collapse to repetition, and finally into emotional distancing. Every phase becomes less about genuine connection and more about what your absence exposed within them psychologically and emotionally.